So there's that. The other beef I have, though, actually is with qualitative research, because if you study anything in relational leadership theory, especially those who are constructionists in thought, they will tell you flat out that they will tell you flat out that the way that we're doing interviewing, which is individually centric, and the small sample sizes, and the fact that if we're studying an individual's ability to recall a moment, we're not in the moment.
Yeah, it's already passed.
It's already passed, and so like you're getting like not the dumbed down version of it, but just their recollection or their account of it. We don't have a true account for what's happening.
It's a perception, and it's biased, and it's already lacking objectivity.
Well, that in there, the reflection piece too is very important, and I'm glad you said that, because where does that reflection take place? Here. It doesn't take place here, and that's very important. That's just that physical example of like I'm thinking about it in here versus like it's actually happening between the coffee and the camera and the conversation and the tattoo and everything else, right? I mean, like there's a lot of things that are going on around that make up the completeness of that situation. Now you're thinking, well, how do you do that in a descriptive way? Right? How do you do that? This descriptive contextualism approach is more one where it's like, I want the quality of the event, but like, well, how do you get all of this without having some type of focused goal at the end that you can then needle with, like
drill down? Yeah.
So there's a difference between those two things. And like one's descriptive and one's functional. One's qualitative, one's quantitative. One's social, one's more behavioral. And there's got to be a line in between those two things where I'm kind of skirting, where I'm saying, you know what, I'm not going to interview anybody. I'm going to do a qualitative study. I'm not really going to interview anybody, which is like,
I know, because that's the way everyone does it.
How do you do? What do you mean? What are you doing?
We're going to have a 5-hour questionnaire.
Or on the other side, it's the questionnaire, right? Yeah. So it's like, or, you know, I can sit down and talk with you and interview 3 or 4 times to do some kind of 5-column analysis or some type of key moment analysis. And I like the key moment analysis stuff. I mean, we can jam on that later if you want, but like, I think there's this other side that is like, okay, well then we'll give them surveys and we'll talk about these things. Well, that's where we'll come up with hypotheses and we'll test those and things like that. And it's like, okay, I'm not doing that either. What I want to do is if I prioritize the situation as a unit of analysis, I don't have to interview anybody anymore per se. My only workaround that is to have them play the game, video it, so I can analyze the elements because that's all I'm looking for. And then I'm going to videotape them watching it back and analyze that dialogue.
Yeah,
but they're gonna watch it like right away afterwards, and then I'll do the analysis. And I don't have to be there. I can be there because you know, the whole thing with qualitative is like you can't interfere too much. You can't participate with them too much.
Otherwise, you're adding in bias.
Yeah, and so there's ways for accounting for that too. And so especially over the last 3 years, I've been trying to, and I'm not taking you with me right now to my basement, my lair, my bat cave, if you will. That has.
We'll add some pictures later.
Yeah, maybe. But I have a giant white or blackboard downstairs where I'm like tattooing all these things together and suturing them together. To make sure that I'm accounting for all these little buckets, these mini buckets of things, these considerations, not in a way to try to make both camps happy. It's just, I see the quality notes that need to be hit here, and I get the functional, textural notes here that go over here. Yeah. There's so much more to be analyzed here. I'm just thinking, like, how can we just focus on how these elements relate and talk first, and then say, let's go for it. Let's take these things and let's experiment. Let's move these elements around in the game. Let's come up with new ways of looking at it. And so it's an exciting approach. It's a very labor intensive approach. Lots of mapping, lots of, key moment analysis within their decision sets. I've tested it before. I've seen the gameplay. It's really, really funny. I can share some photos with you. Okay. And that way, if you want to show it online, it's fine. Just places where we've tested it before, but it's the things that I've seen so far with it is, I see something new every time, and sometimes some things remain the same throughout it, which makes me think that in the vacuum of this activity, in this situation, there are some tenets that ring true, and I think that those are the beginnings of what could be sensitizing concepts, like concepts that we could follow and chase and say, hey, let's drill down now.
Yeah,
and let's experiment with this.
No, that would be interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah,
because the long-term implications of this, by the way, are simply just if we're not going to look at leadership as a role, granted, the role is important to an extent.
Mm-hmm.
What is the extent to which then we can start to build more process related activities that allow us to build the culture of decision making in the organization, as opposed to we're just going to wait to get our marching orders?
Well, not even decision making. Yeah. I mean, decision making is just part of it, right? It's really how you interact with other people. It's about how you build that environment to create better leadership, and not just one individual, but everybody.
Yeah.
Because I don't know about you, but my idea of leadership is not so much that it's the one person. It's that people give you that authority at some level to go ahead and lead and manage what's going on. So, and obviously in a hierarchical organization like a business, you do have somebody giving you, of course, the authoritative role through your role.
Yep.
And then the people who you manage can tell you to screw off, or can accept exactly what you say and follow your request. Because good leaders request, they don't order.
Yeah.
So it's, I don't know. I think it has a lot
but
of
see, even that makes me pause and think like, okay, what does a good leader do? So like good leaders request, they don't give orders. Well, in some cases they have to give orders because the situation demands that. And then we would, because this is where I get, everyone asks me questions. They're like, well, if you're going to prioritize the situation as a unit of analysis, the focus, right? Isn't it the same thing as situational leadership? I'm like, no. Why? The reason why it's not the same is because we're saying, here is some linchpin situations that you can be in, but they're all prioritized around the behavioral element of response. So we're in an emergency, so I need to have an authoritative response. Now, the problem in practice, and I've seen every person who's had a manager that's reading on that leadership book that they got from Barnes and Nobles or somewhere, or if that's still
Leadership for Dummies. That is still a place.
Okay.
Schuler's is the one that's not.
I could have said something like another place like Media Player or something like that. People are like, oh, where is this guy from? Like, what age is this guy from?
No, they're going to the Amazon store these days. Yeah. The physical Amazon store, not just the one online.
We'll just say airport level reading.
There we go.
Okay. So I'm picking it off the place where I can still buy a Snickers bar. Like, that's where we're going for leadership books.
Unfortunately, yes.
So, well, academia has to do better.
Oh yeah,
So that's true too. I mean, we have
because all it's popular press. Yeah.
Well, hence this format.
Exactly.
Get the dialogue going. Let's get a conversation going.
Sorry, I keep interrupting you.
No, that's fine. So
you're about to explain it, and I say something else.
I'm like trying to think like, what was it then I was going to say? So the idea there is that if you have a manager who is reading these things and is trying out these new things, and you're the, subordinate or the, employee that's, reporting in up through them and through that hierarchical structure that you talk about, I'm seeing them trying these things that are not normal to their behavior. And I'm like, that doesn't seem very authentic. So guess what? Now we're going to create this new thing called authentic leadership. It's like we just put a new word in front of leadership, and like this is going to be our new thing that we're going to practice. It's like, I wish we'd stop.
But that's what happens all the time. We were having this conversation with the way that I was describing Agile. Somebody had talked to me about Agile, and I was like, oh, it's SAM, the SAM model from learning.
Oh, okay, yeah.
So it's iterative design and iterative process to finish a product. And
iterative and yet inclusive.
Yeah. And then somebody goes, oh, design thinking. I'm like, what the hell is design thinking? And
you mean design leadership.
Yeah, well, it's the same thing. I was like, it's the same thing as these other two things. Somebody else just repackaged it, put a bow on it that looked a little prettier to somebody else, and sent it out to them.
Yeah.
I was like, that's great work, guys. I'm like, that's...
No, see, don't get me wrong, though. Like, I was thinking about this, too, because you sent me a bunch of questions to consider before we sat down for this conversation. And I thought one of them that got me thinking the most was the one at the end where you talked about what does success look like.
Mm-hmm.
And there was a couple of other questions that you had, too. But I was just that one specifically, I sat there and I'm like, well, it's funny that you should bring that up because... the portion of the contextualism portion of my chapter 2 in my dissertation is where I'm spending a lot of time talking about just that. where I'm talking about this idea of like, without like, I thought the way that you intended me to ask that question is, what does success look like for business? And I'm thinking, okay, great question, if that's what you meant. But it just as a whole, it's like, that is the question that has to be asked, period. By any group is approaching any type of decision-making set. Because what I'm seeing, whether it's just through being a professor or in just being, just in the corporate world, I'm seeing like, we're not great at asking that question up front.
Oh, totally.
Now, people are like, well, wasn't that the visionary note? Yeah, no. It's one thing for one person to come from above and say, hey, here's the vision of what it is that we'd like you to, this is what we're doing. This is the direction that we have to do. And like, but we know that what happens from that moment to the final product, whether you're an agile, waterfall, I don't care where you're at. Mm-hmm. There are differences in the approach, but the understanding of what success looks like and how we continuously talk about that and how we create space to talk about that, how we afford the time to talk about that. These are all the elements of a situation, like the money associated with building this product and whether or not we all understand we're on budget or not. Yeah. Like all those things have to be, how are we upping our game in terms of this process of leadership to get to the end result of saying, yes, that was a success. We've learned from it and we can move on. It's not just forming, storming, norming, performing, that kind of stuff. It's like,
those are great ideas, but
they're great. But in execution, it's different every time because the elements are different.
Yep.
The market's different. The people on the team are different. Some of them are going to leave. Some of them are going to get fired. Some are going to come back to us from a different group, whether it's an agile model.
Well, and even it's the same group, different time. Yeah. That's a whole different aspect.
And before we can just stay here and say like, oh, let's just complain about that.
Yeah.